they didn't have much good to say.
How do you spell that? Institute?
MANUMET, the Manomet Institute, and they have facilities in Maine and in Massachusetts. I think it's Massachusetts, but yeah.
Okay, I'll look that up.
Thanks, George.
Sure.
So since we do have, I guess, a little bit of time to kill before our speaker gets here, if they're in fact coming, how does everybody feel about doing in-person next meeting? Is that something we want to just go ahead and jump in and do?
I would certainly be in favor of that.
Okay.
It's time for us to get back to it.
Yeah, and I know too, David, you know, you've wanted maybe us to express, and I don't know, the timing might not be right anymore, but you've wanted us to, as a group, express support for the Right to Clean Water Amendment. And you know, we haven't really been able to do that formally. So if that's still something that would make sense for us to do, we could do that next month as well.
I'm actually not worried about it right at the moment. What I'm going to do
Okay.
though, but what I do want to do is I want to get the county, you know, I want to see if I can get the county commission on board. You've read that amendment. It's completely different than previous versions. And we had some really super attorneys going over this one to get out some of the kinks and some of the things that, and we also made a decision that we would back off from rights of nature arguments in the amendment to get some things accomplished to getting clean water. And I think that was also accomplished fairly well in this version of the amendment. I still believe that rights of nature is the right thing to do, but at the same time, you know, Florida citizens aren't really ready for it. And I think that, you know, they need to, but they're ready to have something to stop their water from being so polluted. So
Yeah. Well, yeah, appreciate you sending the revised amendment language along and all the work that you're doing with that.
Thank you.
And yeah, whenever it seems prudent to have a discussion as a group about it, you know, I don't know if everybody's necessarily on board or what kind of, you know, conversation might happen around it, but you know, I think it's definitely something important for us to discuss, and you know, if we all support it, then we should make that known when it's a good time to do so.
Yeah, I mean, just a caveat, when, you know, for those of you who haven't read it yet, when you read it, you know, for the most part, I think it makes perfect sense to, you know, to have an amendment like this and put it in place, because I don't see the legislature always acting in good faith, you know, or following the law themselves. And I think they avoid, you know, doing a lot of things that the law demands of them and requires of them to do. And they just avoid it because they can. And on the other hand, it's not going to be, you know, just a giveaway. You know, if we have that amendment in place, we're still going to have to collect evidence and, you know, good scientific evidence proving that there is harm, you know, has taken place. And, you know, before we're going to be able to, you know, to win cases. The difference is this amendment only targets the state. And it says if you put out a permit and that permit caused pollution, responsible for pollution, then, you know, the state's responsible, and they're the ones that, you know, are the ones that we can hold responsible for that. If they did something, if they also, whether they did it actively or passively, in other words, they did something by not doing something or did something active wise to cause pollution, or that resulted in pollution, then they can still be held responsible for that. And, you know, I think that's the only way to really go about it. We're not going to be going after businesses or individuals of anything. We're just saying, you know, the way to really deal with this is, you know, the state has to come down to it. And what I'm hoping is after, you know, after a number of cases are successfully prosecuted this way, you know, against real pollution with real good scientific evidence proving it, but where that in circuit courts where it's going to really get the best viewing, that the state will then start to change its policies, water policies.
Sounds good. We can, I mean, since our speaker's not here, and kind of skip over that presentation for now, and go on to the community conversation forum. I had to leave early last meeting, so I'm not 100% sure where we left off, but we did have, we were going over a list of subjects, and then we kind of got into a question of how, if we should be fielding the public for ideas, and then Mark sent over to everybody a survey, which I assume that's something that we'd want to send out to either the public in general or to specific groups to kind of see what they think we should cover for our topic. Does that sound right to everybody? Does that sound like where we left off?
I get the idea that Mark didn't like that idea.
Oh, I mean, we got a survey draft with all the other attachments.
Yeah, well, yeah. I talked to Steve about it.
Begrudgingly.
He didn't, I don't think Steve didn't feel comfortable with that. Just because, and I can't say that whether Mark Sexton had any issue in it or not, but I don't think that they just like to ask for public survey. It just becomes, because then you got to go through all those, you never know how many people are going to respond, and they're going to come in with all kinds of off the wall complaints and stuff. And it's just that, I guess they've tried this in the past, and that's why Steve, he was the one that suggested, I thought it was a good idea, just come up with a list. Doesn't have to be an extensive one, top half dozen that you envision over the next couple of years that you'd like to give a presentation on, send it to the board and have them rank it. Or if they have others issues that they'd like to discuss, they can at least write it in and not, but that way we can just send it as an email to the board members.
To our board,
To the county commission, yes.
to the, okay, the Board of County Commissioners, okay.
Yes.
Mark, are you aware of some of the topics that the commissioners have they talked about any that you've heard about?
No, not that. I mean, Anna's interested in agricultural issues. And Mary's interested in affordable housing and incorporation of regenerative energy like solar on those type of facilities. I can't say that any of the other board members have. I mean, Ken's on the statewide water resource committee or something, so I would think anything water related, but I couldn't say that there's any specific. I mean, the list that y'all have is excellent and very comprehensive, and if you wanted to take the ones that y'all had particularly interest in that you'd like to see potentially give presentation, and then give it to the commission and let them kind of go from there. But I agree that, the more local, which is kind of the way y'all are expressing interest, is the better way to go, rather than a big picture climate change issue. It's more, related to stuff in Alachua County, I think that was a good suggestion.
Yeah, I think the majority of us, if not everyone, kind of felt that was a good idea.
Yeah, I think it's good.
And it would necessarily, I mean, not necessarily, but it's likely that if we passed it to the county commissioners, they would be more likely to want us to cover things that had to do with local issues. So,
well, I agree. I think it's a good opportunity for y'all to interact with, because we got a couple new commissioners, and Mary was on EPAC years ago, and so I think it just to kind of like say, listen, this is what y'all have in mind, but we'd like some feedback from the commission on what they would like to see too, and so I think nobody that I'm aware of, other committees have not gone to that degree, at least during the last, few years I've been around. So I think it's a good way to go. And I mean, Steve, I didn't even think about that really until, I talked to Steve and he said, look, he recommended going that route. I think it just kind of like, gives y'all an opportunity to have more interaction with the board.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I wish that I think it's Melissa was here, because I know she was the one who was the main advocate of doing the survey. And I like that idea. I'd hate to like decide to do that and then she has feedback that is kind of different. But
No, I don't think as long as the topics that she referenced are similar to what y'all have in the committee overall would like to have present to the board, I think she wouldn't have any issue with that. I think it's just,
yeah.
I really didn't even think about it when y'all discussed it until talking to Steve. He said, you get a lot of off the wall kind of.
I'm sure you do.
And I'm thinking, yeah,
I'm sure you do.
the issues that I deal with on a daily basis, there's some things that come in that I'm like, holy cow. So yeah, I think it gives an open forum for people to vent. And that's not kind of what y'all are looking to support. I think it just, I think you narrow it down, let the commission kind of like come up with their list. If they don't have, if it's something that y'all have on the list is not, they may go with your list and go, yeah, that's all the ones that they could think of. But I know each of them have kind of pet topics that they like to kind of focus on. And I think, they just might have something. And of course they have a lot of contacts themselves and they could actually say, well, I'd like to hear about this issue. And here's a contact that they can provide the committee, to go with that.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether the commission, if asked, what do they think are the three or four maximum things that are highest on the list for, let's say, solving in Alachua County? We could probably come up with climate change, water, and air quality as three major ones, and recycling, I guess, fourth. If we just specialized in focusing on those and dwelled on those, like a specialist, you become more familiar with the weeds and the details. Is there an advantage for us to dwell on the ones that we might perhaps all agree on are the most important things facing the county? In other words, do we have to readdress repeatedly from different angles various aspects of these issues?
Yeah, George, are you kind of saying maybe that doing one community conversation on a topic, once you kind of zero in and look at all the details and the depth is not really enough, and it makes sense to kind of revisit the same topic, but coming at it, exploring different parts of it? Is that?
Yeah, I was watching a show today about a guy who decided to, as a young kid, to become a sword maker or a knife maker. And he spent his entire life pursuing his passion. And he didn't just get into the shape and the design, but the metallurgy. He got a special metallurgical microscope. I mean, this guy went to depths so he could tell you everything about, even on a molecular level, by getting data from material scientists. So there was an example of a guy who went to depths and retrieved information so that he could understand things in a totally bigger, a broader and deeper way. And he felt he got more insight. I don't know if you can translate or apply that to this kind of situation, but to me, those four topics being so urgent, we have a conversation with the community we don't get a tremendous number of people showing up. And in some respects, we're preaching to the choir of the same familiar people who are either, Facebook or Zoom meeting, present on the Zoom. I don't know if we're reaching people and penetrating through their armor, so to speak, of
That's why I like the
indifference
idea of
or-
recording these. Recording, we can reach a much broader audience because they don't have to be there on one given night, and they can sit at home and watch, the CC, and they'll get ideas from that. By the way, I was going to suggest that, in the past, I very regularly went to see all the commissioners. I can usually make a loop through them in about a week's time. That's just because due to their schedule changes, it's kind of hard to get, in to see them in any kind of a reasonable schedule. So it takes about a week to get through seeing all of them. And but I haven't been doing that, in the last 2 years because of the pandemic. So what I could do is, if we would go through the list again, whittle it down to the subjects that we really want them to think about. I can go and talk to them, and plus, they often come up with some great suggestions on their own. So, we don't have to have that by itself, but I'd like to, give them a list and let them maybe even send it to them ahead of time and let them look through it and see, see what they want to say on that. And I would add to the list of things you put out, George. Air, I don't think we can do anything with. The state passed a rather exclusive or exclusionary, thing about protecting air for just Alachua County a number of years ago. But I was thinking, that there was that one topic of septic to sewer, and what kind of an effect would that have, on the county?
That's a good one.
Yeah, that's a good one.
It's going to be, a part of that we're not going to really be able to analyze too well, and that's the cost. But what would happen from the standpoint of the environment? What would happen there to our water? What would happen to the ground? What would happen in general if we did that as a county? So things like that, I think, they do have value. But I know from past experience, if I talk to them all, that at least one of them, maybe two or more, will say, "Oh, if you could do a conversation about this or about that," because they all have ideas of things that they don't think are getting across to citizens. And so, in our role as, being a facilitator, as a communicating from the ideas from the board to citizens, that's something we should be doing in a CC. And maybe we don't even know what that subject is yet. So, we would have to talk to commissioners, get the idea from them, and then do enough research on that so that we would be able to determine whether that would make a good CC or not. But it would be a starting point for us. And I think that bringing them into our loop, so to speak, by meeting with them and discussing, the various topics that we've already looked at, and as well as putting in their topics to consider, might be a very, very fruitful process.
Yeah, I agree with you, David. And like you said, I think there might be some topics or some, kind of specific subtopics within the broader things that we've painted that they would really like to see get a bigger platform. And, in terms of just to touch back on the, trying to reach more people and whatnot, I of course, that's something that we should always think about. But, on the other hand, I think just focusing on putting together a good presentation and getting it out there, and then it's kind of out of our hands, to some extent, who's going to end up watching it and who's not. And I think just having a good presentation put together and getting the message out as much as we can is basically the extent to which we can do it. And then hopefully the right people see it and enough people see it and it has an impact.
What problem see that way is I don't know where all of the the recorded CCs are at this point in time. There's not too many. I think there's like maybe 3 or 4, but I don't know where they are. I think I guess they're ultimately put on YouTube, but I don't know if there's a link to them from the Alachua County website or not. So that would be something that'd be nice to find out if there is one page that we have where all the links are.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. EPAC doesn't really have its own presence, as far as I know. Like everything is kind of under the umbrella of the Alachua County. And so I believe the recorded conversations are somewhere in the video section of the county's Facebook page. Mark, do you know if that's where they're kind of hiding out?
There's a page in YouTube that is all and I'll give y'all a link. I post all everybody, all the liaisons post the recorded presentations on that site. It's not run by the county. It just happens to be in an account by somebody in our communications department. So it's each of the 30 odd. Now, having said that, I've seen that, obviously I've looked at it. There's not, other than EPAC and a couple others, there's really, for whatever reasons, people are not posting their recordings. I'm not going to guess why that is, but there are very few committees that actually post. They're supposed to be recording and posting, and it will continue after COVID and everything. So just for purposes of documentation, in the future, so and that YouTube site is open to the public. Anybody can look at those videos. Does the county publicize that well enough? I would guess not. I've never seen public communications posted saying, you want to look at these committee presentations, go to this website. I don't know. But to answer your question, no, they're not on the county's Facebook page. There's limits to how much they can put on that page. Just
So
the sheer volume.
they're on basically somebody's YouTube account. They
Yes.
have like a YouTube page with all of the videos that.
Right. It's
And is that account jointly owned, or is it just one person? Because if it's just one person, that's a bit of a vulnerability if they leave the county and nobody has the password, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll just give it to another under their. It's a staff and communications. It's his account. They'll
Okay.
give it. They'll just redo it in somebody else's name. If he left the county, but
Because you can, like with a Facebook or the YouTube account, with the YouTube page, you can give, managerial rights to multiple people. And if he hasn't done that already, you might suggest that to him just as a way to kind of secure the account in case something happens to him or, he leaves or whatever.
right.
But yeah, I appreciate that. And I didn't realize we had that YouTube account. And I think, yeah, if you could send that link along.
Yeah.
We could all take a look at it. So thanks, Mark, for that. Okay. So, David, I can draft, I don't know how you want to do this. I can draft a letter with the topics that we've come up with. And then you can, and I can send that to Mark. And then if you want to take that around to the commissioners and talk to them, if you want to do it like that, or we can make it less formal if you just want to, have a conversation with them individually or.
Also, I want to.
Have that to start with, yeah.
I think it's fantastic, that David can go to all those commissioners. And I really also would, if possible, would like for an opportunity that more of us can interact with the commissioners. And I don't know how to do that. Maybe have a Zoom with them, with all of them, or with a lot of them.
But I don't know if they'll meet you in their office, but they probably are getting back to that. And there's no reason why they wouldn't. I plan on going and I call their secretary and make an appointment with, for each one of them. I say exactly what I'm there for, what business I want to, discuss. And that, I would like to make an appointment for all of the commissioners, and give me the best time. So within about a week's period of time that I can see them all and they'll work it out.
And that's how we do it at staff level too. If we,
Okay.
I've got a presentation to board next Tuesday, and we either will meet individually, Steve and I will meet with them individually on Monday, either physically at the office or Zoom. And each of them block off, depending on, the topic, 15 to 30 minutes. And you just go from boom to boom to boom to boom. But you have to, as David knows, you have to do it for all of them. You can't just pick and choose, which board members. They all have to be, and at the same time, they cannot be in the same room together.
Oh,
But yes, I think David's
Okay.
his suggestion was pretty good.
okay. Sounds good.
You can't tell another commissioner what the other commissioner you just met with said either. I mean, that sort of thing falls under being a violation of sunshine.
The sunshine, right. So, John just came on. He's coming on now, for the presentation. So,
Okay, great. Well, let's just wrap up our conversation here,
Okay.
and then we'll hand it over to John. So David, you cut out a little bit about my drafting a letter and then forwarding it to Mark to send to the board, and then if anybody wants to add topics to it, and then you can go ahead and visit all the commissioners. Does that sound like a plan? Or
Well, I'm not going to be able to get responses from other people. You can send the letter in, but then, the responses won't be republished. Won't republish those. You'd only publish yours. But, unless we want to take time to discuss what we're going to give, you can just, give me the list and say, here's priority. Here's how we prioritize them. And maybe these are a couple of new ones that I thought of, whatever you want to do. And then I'll go with that.
okay. When I left hi, John, we're just finishing up a conversation on one of the agenda topics, and then we're ready for your presentation. Okay. So were there any new topics that were brought up after I left last time that I should add to the list? No. Okay.
no.
I'll add septic to sewer. I don't think that specifically was on there. And then the other one we have, and then, yeah, we can go from there.
Okey-doke.
Okay, great. Anything else before we turn it over to John for his presentation? Okay. So we have John Rankin, who is, I don't know if I pronounced your name right, John. I think you're on mute.
John, you're on mute.
Still can't hear you.
Okay, better?
Yeah,
Can you hear me now?
I can
Okay.
hear you.
Yes, and I have to apologize profoundly because this was supposed to be done on my computer, and I had tested all of the hardware previously, but for some reason, I am having software issues and it is not working, and that is making giving a proper presentation more or less impossible since I'm on my little tiny phone right now. So
The computers
yeah.
always like to act up when you have a presentation, right?
Right, and always at the very last minute, because I'd verified all the hardware both separately and together. So I'm not going to say it's not my fault. I'm just going to say I don't know what I did wrong. And trying to do this on my phone. Now that is very helpful. Okay, if you're able to actually screen share the slides where I'm unable to do so, because there's just no way I can make that happen on my phone and talk to you. Okay, if you can actually present the slides and we can walk through this, that is a great kindness. Thank you. Okay. So this actually does, Tom put these together. They do a surprisingly good job of speaking for themselves, but I can walk through all of this for you all. And it basically, to just give the broad strokes as an outline ahead of time, there's a few key points here. And it's just basically that, yes, there's already a biomass power plant in place in Gainesville. And yes, there have been some issues surrounding it because it is a debt. They planned it anticipating increasing fossil fuel costs that did not materialize because of new technology such as fracking. However, now we see this presentation is timely because of current events we're seeing now with things like Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we're seeing now just how fragile world economies can be and why it's good to have a diversity of options. And this presentation presents one of those. And I'll actually let you go ahead and run the slide since I don't have the ability to do that. So this gets into the ecology side of things, and basically what people call a lot of names, but one of them is elephant grass, and it's one of the giant grasses that grows really well here, and perennial. You harvest the tops each year after a freeze kills them, but they build up more and more root mass each year, which provides an ongoing growing soil sink for atmospheric carbon. And now as there's talk about carbon credits, things like that, it provides a potential for multiple revenue streams. Next slide, please. Hopefully people can hear me. There we go. And yeah, and this one's actually really important because here you see something that people don't realize. There's studies out, and unfortunately, I don't really have the ability to send this to you at the very last minute, but there's some very interesting studies that have just come out that haven't made it into the slides for this presentation yet, looking at the fact that all human factors in terms of production and release of CO2 to the atmosphere, in terms, especially with regard to fossil fuels, pale in comparison to natural processes even now. And especially when you look at some of the sadder things like the mass burn-offs that are human processes, but are still dealing with interactions with the natural world of rainforest in Brazil, for example. So when you look at the combination of both human interactions with natural processes and just the normal cycling of the die-off of the natural world and to carbon and that process, then flow of living tissue into the atmospheric carbon is far greater than the contribution on an annual basis. Obviously, the concern in terms of fossil fuels is that it's an ongoing factor. The natural process, barring man-made activities, is a recycling factor to a large extent. But what becomes really important here is there's far more carbon that can be sequestered in the soil and other natural pools. And this gives us an opportunity to create new pools where they haven't existed. Obviously, everybody talks about things like agroforestry, growing trees, whatnot, but some of those, one of the obvious problem that everybody's also aware of with that is it's a long time to pay back. The good thing about some of these crops like elephant grass is it gets you much of the same environmental benefit with a payback in a year or two. Next slide, whenever you're ready. Okay, this one pretty much speaks for itself. You can see how fast the rise has been recently. We can debate about how big the effects have been. We can talk about, you know, how serious the effects have been. There's so much data out there from every side that trying to figure out all the details is challenging. I'll just leave it at that. Trying to really fully understand this is hard, but if you can set up a situation that is genuinely a win for everybody, where you can provide economic stability for society as a whole by having something that's not dependent on the vagaries of world politics like we're seeing now, something that's a win for the environment and a win for local farmers, and that provides a layer of insulation for the people who have to buy energy locally from world economics like we see now. If you can provide profit to people while doing something that's morally and environmentally good, it seems like it's a win all the way around to me. And so, you know, it seems like it's straightforwardly logical. Does that mean that there are challenges to get there now? But it seems kind of logical to me. And I think everybody's probably had time to read this slide by now as well. Next, whenever everyone's ready. Okay. And there you see it. And yeah, there you see it as well. And yeah, basically, oh my goodness, that slide's actually, that's at least a year old. And it doesn't give you a good perspective of the scale. There's no person in those slides. But yeah, and that's the 10 to 15 tons an acre a year of rye matter. And if there were a person standing there, you'd see that the giant varieties are over a head tall. That's at the end of the year after the first season, which is why everything's brown. It's basically ready for harvest. I guess that's everything. Next slide, whenever. Yeah, that's showing on, that's the hard, okay. In the forefront, you're showing shorter 4-H type varieties, which is why they're smaller. In the background, you're seeing the giant varieties. Yeah, that's the 4-H cultivar, and it actually is. It's a little easier to dig up and get a picture of the roots with the small variety, and that I think is a 1-year-old plant. I could be wrong; it might be 2, but I think that's a 1-year-old plant, which gives you plant, and it's planted the way sugarcane is. You basically take the above ground stems, cut them into sections, and lay them horizontally in the ground, with a very shallow covering of soil on top of it. And that gives you some idea of just how fast root mass develops beneath the ground. And it's that root mass that both is growing and then burning the above ground part. So that's basically a carbon neutral recycling of carbon out of and back into the atmosphere. But it's this part that's below ground that's increasing by roughly that much per plant per year. That's the sequestration factor, if that makes any sense. And like it says, it's surprisingly dense and woody, even though it's a grass. To get kind of technical here, the above ground part has a lower lignin content, which is why some of the varieties work well as forage. The leaves have have a low lignin content. The stalks have a high lignin content, but the underground portions have a very high lignin content. I know this is delving into the chemistry, but lignin is basically the type of cellulose that makes wood wood, as opposed to other kinds of cellulose in plant matter. And next slide, whenever. Okay, and there you see it. You can actually see that's early spring. And so after basically an entire winter has passed, it actually is a good demonstration of what I'm just saying. After the passage of a winter, the leaves have basically sort of decayed away from the standing vegetation, but the stalks are still there because of the higher lignin content, because basically what you'd see with leaves rotting away and the stalks being woodier. And you see regrowth happening at the base, and it gives you sort of an illustration of the process. And this basically is sort of why you have the stalks looking like they have a higher potential to be a good feedstock for combustion processes. It's not quite bamboo, but it's closer to bamboo than it is to an ordinary grass, if that makes any sense. And next, please. Without having the hollow factor that most bamboos does. If you've never actually handled the material, it's a little interesting to try and understand completely. And this is a picture of me before I started to lose weight, and just showing the growth rate and size of Leucaena. And Leucaena, the difficulty with Leucaena is that unfortunately there's some restrictions on it, because one species in the genus does spread too rapidly. Others do not, but the whole genus is restricted. We're in discussions and negotiations with the state of Florida because of the fact that it, as it shows here, can fix up to 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre, another very timely factor. I don't know if you've looked at the estimates, and there's different reports from different sources, and I'm having a hard time finding hard numbers on this, which is why I don't even have information to present conclusively, because I can't get sources that all agree. But it looks like Russia produces 40% of the world's nitrogen fertilizer, according to some sources, some of which include like the actual USCIA. And that's frightening, because we're already starting to see a price spike in nitrogen fertilizer prices. And so we are definitely going to either need to start making more of our own nitrogen domestically, which isn't technically difficult. The Haber process was invented in Germany in World War I, but there are environmental ramifications, both because of the immense amounts of energy involved and because of the horrific environmental impacts in the event of an accident. And I can speak to this because one happened very near my own house, and my grandmother developed cancer a few years later when a tanker spilled. A freight train went over and had an ammonia spill, and she developed lung cancer a few years later. So it's not like there are no consequences if things go wrong, but and it ended in her death. But without fertilizer of some sort, there's not crops. So this is something that Tom has pushed very hard, is more natural sources to the growth of legumes. This is one of his favorites, but there are concerns because one of the species is very invasive. Dr. now recently deceased Brubaker, I think it's Brubaker, at the University of Hawaii, has managed to develop a seedless clonal variety. And state of Florida's tentatively accepted the idea of propagating that in the state of Florida. Anyway, next slide, please. Okay. And this is pretty self-explanatory. You can still get a hold of copies of those if you're actually interested. I guess I'll let people have a moment to read this. And I guess that hopefully, yeah. Okay, next slide. And yes, so Dr. Prine retired a number of years ago, sadly now also deceased. But all this research was published. It's now all out there in the literature. And available for anybody who wants to check this. And I will also add, while a lot of this research was done at UF, it's not like that is the only research out there now, and it's not even like it's the only English language research out there anymore. There's a lot of research that's come out from Florida, Louisiana, Texas, Hawaii, anywhere warm in the United States. You'll find some interesting stuff, but you'll also find massive amounts of research out of Australia, out of any of the former British colonies that are in a warm part of the world. You will find volumes of English language literature. So if you want to actually do your own independent cross-checking of what I'm saying, it is pretty easy to do. And of course, if there is somebody who is more fluent in foreign languages than I am, the world opens up to you, because there are volumes of research in Brazil, some of which is in English, but much of which, of course, is in Portuguese. Volumes of Spanish language literature that I've tried to wade through from other countries in South America, but I'm just not quite good enough in my Spanish. And then, of course, a surprising amount of literature coming out of Asia. A little bit from China, but a lot from Thailand and other places that you just wouldn't have initially anticipated. There's a lot of literature that's come out of single English language study, and some of them are surprisingly well conducted when you dive into the materials and method. And I don't say that to be racist or ethnocentric. It's just, I look at this and I say, my goodness, it's clear these people's lives depend on this and they're taking it more seriously than we do. So I'll just leave it at that there's the stuff that Tom's referenced in this, but there is a worldwide body of literature on these topics. Next slide. Okay, pretty obvious. The picture says a whole lot more than the words do. They're giant machines. You can do this on a truly industrial scale and make it happen quickly and economically if it's possible to put together a decent amount of capital up front. And that's where we're probably looking at getting together a large enough coalition to get something along the lines of a governmental grant to make this process start in the first place. Because one or two people saying we'd like that probably isn't enough to get an earmark or something in place. But getting a bunch of people coming to 3 or 4 congressmen and saying we'd like to see that happen, that's a different story. Next slide, whenever. And there you go. Another example of basically the same idea. Next slide, whenever. Okay, so basically this is our idea here. We just want to do a demonstration plot, and we want to raise enough money to do proof of concept. We'd like to try and plant 60 acres. Basically, the idea is that is enough to do a really good test fire. From what we can figure out, it would talk about $1 million. And we're not asking you all to come up with money for that. We're just asking for people to help back us, go to Congress and in big scale, large scale investors. People like Chase Manhattan, for example, who are looking for things other than traditional fossil fuels to invest in, to raise money and put together the funding to do proof of concept and show that this does in fact really work and doesn't just work in a technical sense, but works and makes sense in an economic sense. And if you've had time to read this, then next slide, please. Or is that the last slide? Yeah, okay. And okay, next slide. Yeah. So basically, this just says who we are. Started out as a not-for-profit quite a while ago now, at least from my point of view. I'm only in my 40s. But we basically reincorporated much more recently, 2016. And because we think that it is a more realistic way to get this moving because it gives us the opportunity to bring in for-profit investors. I guess that's everything for this one. Go ahead, next slide. And yeah, was that the last one? Yeah, okay. And I think that's everything. Okay, if anybody is still with us, I would like to thank you all for your time.
Thank you, John, for your presentation. Are you available to take questions?
Of course.
Okay, great. Any questions from the members or feedback?
I'm even here to take criticism if people have criticism.
I just wanted to ask, what is the, sorry, George has his hand up first. So.
Yeah, just really quickly, how difficult would it be to go back to the beginning? We had a graph of pre-1958 and then the sudden spike. I never got a chance to take a screenshot of that, and I'd love to have that image.
Yes, if you could step through the slides to that one, by all means, please.
That would be so cool.
And yes, this is the thing. And this is the truly bizarre thing when you look at this, because it makes it obvious. And I'm not casting stones here, but it makes it fairly obvious that it is not actually the developed world's carbon production that is causing the real issue here. And I am not wanting to shut the door on the rest of the world. The developed world got the chance to develop, okay? So I'm not saying that we got the chance to develop and we should now shut the door on the rest of the world. But you look at this timeline and it shows that, and it makes it obvious that the developed world had largely developed by the time that that started spiking. And so it's basically the fact that the rest of the world, which urgently needed to, these people needed to not be starving to death. But it's the fact that everybody started developing that caused this spike. So simply trying to conserve in the developed world is not an answer. And telling people in China and India and Africa and Latin America that they have to go back to subsistence farming is cruel. So this is where we get to the point of saying we need sequestration answers if we think that carbon is an issue. We can discuss other topics like safer ways to do nuclear power, but that is a whole different discussion. We can discuss separate issues like movements towards, electric vehicles, but that is another huge issue that's not necessarily economically feasible for, say, India for a while to come. But ways that make cost-effective sense to sequester the ongoing production of carbon, that's something that's within our realm to do something about. Whereas I doubt that even if we were all to agree that it was a good idea to build a modern 4th-gen safe nuclear reactor, and we all felt comfortable about the long-term storage plans for the waste and all that stuff, even if we were all on board with that, I don't think any of us have the political clout to do much about it. This is something we actually have a means and a chance of affecting for positive change, if that makes any sense.
Yep. Thank you.
So that's just sort of, you change, it's like that serenity prayer. God grant me the strength to change the things I can, the grace to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. My dad was one of the best men I ever knew, but he did struggle with alcoholism for a number of years. He went through AA, and they taught him that. And it changed his life, because he had a horrific childhood, and that was the reason for the alcoholism. And learning to change what he could, accept the things he couldn't change, and recognize the difference, changed his entire life. And he taught me that, and it always seemed like good words to live by.
David, did you have a question?
George was before me.
Oh,
You were
okay.
talking, George Papaldi jumped in there. George Hockmuth had his
Oh,
hands up.
sorry.
I guess I'm more interested, listening to your presentation, and I've known Tom and Gordon Prine and all the others for years and years and years, decades. But when this topic comes up, I always start thinking about, okay, fine, you're talking about growing a biomass crop and benefiting from the carbon cycle, I will say, but there's another cycle that interacts in here, and that is the nitrogen cycle. And
absolutely,
you're talking about having growers grow this, and I think about irrigation and nitrogen fertilizers to make this economical for a grower to jump into this. So I guess my question is, have you guys done a full-scale head-on, I'll call it a life cycle analysis for a better term, that gets at all of these other environmental issues associated with growing a biomass crop? That's my question.
so,
how much nitrogen, how much water? Are you talking about growing this stuff on poor lands that you ordinarily would not grow high income crops? What kinds of yields does it take for a farmer to be profitable? That kind of an analysis.
I can give you a full answer, because that study has been done. I'm going to just give you complete, full, honest disclosure here. Our check of this has been fairly informal check so far of what is already extensively out there in the literature. This is part of why we want to do a large scale study to verify that everything works the way everybody says it does in the literature, because there has not been a large scale study done here in North Florida. There have been small scale studies done in North Florida. There have been large scale studies done in other places. And based on small scale studies done here, large scale studies done in other places, it is to grow it here, because the soils are poor here. Basically, we have sand here. You basically, to get a good yield, decline a call, my apologies. You basically need nitrogen inputs for optimal yield, roughly equivalent to if you were growing a Bermuda hay crop. So surprisingly low for the amount of biomass you're getting, and less than if you were growing a high dollar crop like tobacco, say. But actually probably a bit more than you might use for even watermelon, but a lot less than you'd use for corn, to give examples for people who might not be familiar with the exact amount of other impacts. Why this is so important I'm guessing from your questions you're all well aware, is in Florida, in sand, it is very challenging to get good percentage uptake of nitrogen fertilizers by plants. Nitrogen fertilizers tend to be inherently very water soluble. If you're really lucky, you can either have things set up for irrigation and do a lot of light irrigation afterwards and not get a heavy rainstorm and everything works beautifully, or you are very lucky and you get a lot of days of nice light rain and everything works very nicely. But if you're very unlucky, you get 4 inches of rain the next day and the plants get almost none of it, and the groundwater gets most of it. So these are the problems. These are why in sandy soils in Florida, you do split application, because even though it's more labor, not only is it better environmentally, it just saves the farmers money. It lowers the risk of having to reapply everything. This being said, the amount of nitrogen, even though it's meaningful, is lower. Why is debated in the literature, because the numbers don't make sense. The amount of nitrogen, when you actually run the amount of protein, you can calculate the protein harvested in the plant versus the amount of nitrogen known to be in the soil and the amount of nitrogen known to be applied, and the numbers come out illogically. The Chinese have concluded in their studies that there is some sort of nitrogen fixation going on, but the plant's clearly not a legume. And so without any mechanism being proposed or understood, that research is not really accepted. However, it is known and actually been tracked down, and a mechanism's now been worked out for sugarcane, that sugarcane, even though it requires much more nitrogen than this crop does, actually still obtains and this is fairly recent research, this is only about a decade old, actually obtains somewhere around 20% of its nitrogen through a fixation with a symbiotic bacteria. And it was very controversial that was happening for a while. And it was eventually pinned down that it was in fact going on. And it was quite big deal of news, but it was not happening. It was only about 20% of the nitrogen, so it wasn't earth-shaking news. But it spurred further research that led to the discovery of the nitrogen-fixing corn that people might have heard of in Mexico, and the huge debates around that. So there are now known mechanisms for nitrogen fixation in grasses, but the crop has not been studied enough to figure out whether or not that's going on for sure, or if a known, and absolutely, as far as I've read so far, in the English language literature at least, there's not been a mechanism identified, but there is a clear discrepancy identified where there's more nitrogen in the plant than is being applied, but it still does not get anywhere near an optimum growth rate without some application of nitrogen in our soils, because they are just that bad. But this does allow you to grow it in soils like we have here, because as you may be aware, basically in terms of crops that are of economic value here, choices are pine trees, hay, watermelons, peanuts, or with very high inputs simply because of the crop's value and the moral issues surrounding it that I'm not even going to touch, tobacco. You don't really have many other options here. Does that sort of address your questions? Oh, irrigation. Irrigation is enormously helpful during establishment. However, if you plant during the rainy season, it does not seem to be truly necessary.
Okay, well, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to see if there had been some research done to, to do.
There has been volumes of research. UF looked at this plant very heavily starting in like the 1930s through the 1980s. So there's been volumes of research done locally, and worldwide there's been volumes of research.
Okay, thanks.
Go ahead, David.
No, I actually took my hand down. But kind of, I think George asked some questions there that kind of answered some of the questions I had, at least on this, as a part of that process. But I'm wondering if that what's your overall concept of the value of this is? Is it that because this is a plant that essentially comes back and is meets its full growth every season, and there's enough of it to harvest and use as a biofuel, that that it's always going to be recycling between the plant and the atmosphere, and it's therefore better than taking something like trees down, or some other thing for using for biomass? Is that the basic concept, or you have something else going on here that you're trying to prove?
Slightly more nuanced. So you cut down and this is where the recent study that I alluded to is. You cut down a tree and you do one of two things with the tree. You burn the trunk of the tree for fuel, and that carbon's released into the atmosphere, or you use it to build a house and it's sequestered for a long time. But either way, with the exception of trees that coppice from the roots, like say our cherries locally, but for most trees, pines, oaks, etc., the more than half in most cases of that tree is below the ground, and it fairly quickly, especially in our climate and soils, rots, releasing the entirety of that carbon back into the atmosphere. So in most cases, half or more of the carbon is within a short period of time. Let us say 5 years to pick a number. Different studies give different results based on where they are in the species of tree studied. So there are very rot resistant tropical hardwoods that'll last 100 years in the soil. There are willows that are gone in a year, everything's rotted away. But in our climate and soils, most of it's disappeared back into the atmosphere in about 5 years. You can go and look into it if you care. It is nuanced and I am oversimplifying. But the difference here is what we're proposing is, yes, the top of the plant will be recycled on an ongoing basis. But each and every year, instead of having the entire bottom of the plant disappear with all that carbon back into the atmosphere, every single year, additional carbon will be sucked out of the atmosphere for the entire life of the plant, and the life of the plant can be decades. If we're able to establish a system where there is true ongoing economic value to the farmer, and we're able to correctly identify the right cultivars, and I will fully admit there is some trial and error here because it's pretty clear in the literature that some cultivars last much longer this way than others. But the beauty of the biofuel use for this is that all of them seem to handle the single seasonal defoliation after frost kill well, because they've already built up the supply, they've already stored a food supply in the root system to come back in spring. Even though it's a basically tropical plant, they seem to adapt to our climate and location well enough to handle that for long-term growth. It's just, are we talking about 10 years of growth or who knows how long? There are up at where is it? Tifton, Georgia. There are decades old, enormous root crowns that you'd have a hard time wrapping you could not, a grown man. I'm a big guy. I'm 6 foot tall with an arm span larger than that, and I can't wrap my arms around the root crowns of some of those elephant grass plants. They've been growing probably longer than I've been alive, and I'm 45. It's just each year they've tucked away, maybe 10 pounds more of carbon, 20 pounds more of carbon into their root system for each and every single plant there. And so that's the advantage there. And that's where the big benefit is. And of course, the other big benefit is that in our locale, these preferred biomass cultivars aren't wasting it trying to spend seeds because the plant is photoperiod dependent. The whole issue and the whole concern about the plant in South Florida is it's spreading into sugarcane fields because it looks enough like sugarcane that it's hard to identify it on site. And of course, it's a grass. So if you use a grass herbicide to kill it, you'll kill the sugarcane. And that's why there's been some questions about the plant. But of course, nobody grows sugarcane this far north in Florida, which eliminates that concern. But on top of that, while there are wild cultivars, a few of them, that can live and spread seed this far north, you don't see it growing everywhere because it's only a few of them that have managed to basically evolve to do that. But the ones that are actually useful for biomass are the clonal cultivars that basically don't manage to flower until so late in the year that it's right about the time that they're going to be frost killed anyway. And they're essentially not wasting the energy producing seeds. Some of them just don't flower at all. The Mott cultivar, you're not going to see flower here unless it's one of those weird years where we just don't get a frost or you're growing it in a greenhouse. It just needs that short of a day length before it flowers. It doesn't flower until what, something like, I think I actually did artificially protect one year and managed to finally get it to flower around about November was right around my birthday, which is November 23rd, and it was about a week after my birthday. It was right at the tail end of November that I finally got the moth to flower. And so I got it to try and produce seeds in December, but even with artificially protecting it, it still got frost killed. And that's basically the thing with all of these giant varieties. They're so day length sensitive that they put so much energy into growth that the frost just kills them and they just don't have the ability to spread. But that's what makes them so useful for biomass and for the things like the moth, so useful for forage. They're not wasting their energy trying to reproduce.
Quick question, Doug, you mentioned how close this is to sugarcane. Does sugarcane also fit into a category of plant that could be used in this way?
So sugarcane has, with a twist, there was some fascinating breeding work done to try and optimize the total energy yield from sugarcane, and it was partly successful. It was called energy cane. A good deal of work was put into it at UF, and basically the idea was to try and develop a version of sugarcane that would let you extract both sugar from the sugarcane for, ultimately the idea was ethanol production, and then have enough pulp left over to, for example, fire the boilers. But you get into the issues that if you have too much, it's very hard to find cultivars where you strike a balance that it's still easily crushed without wasting the energy, and you manage to dry it out without wasting energy in a climate that's good for growing sugarcane, because you can't really grow sugarcane easily in a desert, and you still have enough cellulosic biomass there for it to be useful for something. There are certainly essentially wild, unimproved sugarcane cultivars that can be used in this way. They're just inferior to elephant grass for this purpose, basically. They just don't produce as much yield as far as the ones I'm familiar with, if all you want is a crop for straight up combustion. But there are sugarcane cultivars that appear. I've not worked with them personally, I've only read the literature, but appear to just edge into the realm of probably being economically useful for a dual use crop, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Now let me ask George Hockman a question here. And George, what is your impression about the nitrogen footprint of this plant? The way they're talking about using it.
Well, I guess I heard mixed messages relative to the various crops. If it's similar to growing Bermuda hay, then we're talking 400 plus pounds of nitrogen.
Okay,
you are aware that. Then I heard it was similar to tobacco, which probably is more like 100 pounds. So I'm really not clear for growing on sandy soils in North Florida. Whether we're talking about 100 pounds or 400 pounds. But so anyway.
I apologize, but are you aware that no actual beef cattle farmer growing Bermuda hay actually applies 400 pounds to their Bermuda hay? That may be standard in the dairy industry, but no beef cattle farmer can afford that. They do 120 pounds a year in split doses.
All I'm saying is that the recommendations are 60 to 80 pounds per cutting on Bermuda hay. I don't know about where it goes or who's using it, but those are the recommendations. And so if somebody's using that much nitrogen, then I'm not saying that that's bad to produce the elephant grass. I'm just saying that that's a lot of nitrogen. My main point for bringing up the nitrogen thing has more to do with just the cropping sequences and the cycles, and just knowing how many farmers operate. They all want more, most of them want more fertilizer than IFAS recommends. And when you throw in irrigation on top of it, then you're setting yourself up for for some problems and some issues. And I'm mainly interested in, if I were to look at this particular project and was in a situation where we were talking about putting millions of dollars into it, I guess I would want to know more precisely about what the big picture is relative to some of these other factors that go into crop production, like nitrogen,
Okay.
like irrigation.
I can clarify. I understand the confusion because everything you have said is true, but there is one very important discrepancy here. In real world, in Florida, you get a maximum of 3 hay cuts a year just because of rainfall. You need, if you're making hay, baleage is different. But if you're making actual hay, farmers aren't going to take the time, the effort, the expense, unless they have reason to believe they're going to have time for it to dry. They realize it's rank. They realize it's past optimum. They realize everything isn't the way it's supposed to be. So they apply 60 pounds per hay cut, but they are considering themselves very fortunate to get 3 hay cuts a year. That's the difference in our numbers. And not all of them can afford to do 60 pounds for a hay cut. I'm used to working with beef cattle farmers. I realize it may be different with dairy, and that they may deal with things that just aren't economically workable for the beef industry.
Well, again,
I get it.
I hope that when you make a presentation about that kind of money going into large scale production practices, that these other inputs and nitrogen in particular, that has an environmental issue footprint, that those kinds of things are covered.
I did not. I spoke based on extensive experience in the field, but that experience was limited to real world realities dealing with hay farmers and beef cattle producers, and just the reality that they don't get to cut hay enough. You're right. In theory, you can make more cuts and apply more nitrogen. And you're right, that is the theoretical optimum yield. And I apologize because I did not present clearly enough. But in real life, they just don't get to make enough cuts to apply that much nitrogen. It just doesn't happen.
Okay, well, let me be more specific then. I don't mean to be contradictory here, but what kind of nitrogen rate are we talking about for this grass in North Florida, in the Swanee Valley region, to produce those kinds of yields, dry matter yields that you presented in your presentation? How much nitrogen?
Okay. Yeah, let's talk numbers then specifically. So the recommended is 120 pounds per year for optimum growth. And if you're doing it as a forage crop, then you split it up by the number of cuts that you make. If you're doing it as a biomass crop at the end of the year, you split it up into as many divided dosages as you have the realistic ability to deliver, for the reasons that we've discussed, because we get way too much rain and it washes stuff into the soil way too fast.
Yeah, 120 pounds for what you're getting doesn't sound too awful much, you know.
No, this is why I said, when you actually run the numbers and you do calculations on the amount of nitrogen physically present in the plant versus the amount you administer, they don't add up. But nevertheless, you apply 120 pounds a year and you get 15 tons of biomass, and that biomass has, you know, startlingly, even in these cultivars that we're talking about, for not at the end of the winter, but, you know, at the end of the growing cycle, you're still talking a minimum of 14% protein, sometimes much higher depending on the cultivar, and sometimes more than 15 times dry weight depending on the cultivar. The numbers get very bizarre. They're still there. I'm not really not making it up. There's reams of data, and this is why a lot of scientists scratch their heads.
Part of your program ought to be to produce a production guide.
Yeah, and there actually are some fairly good ones. They just aren't tailored to large scale production in our area. And that actually is sort of the main goal of this whole project, is to produce a large scale production guide for North Florida. There's great production guides if you're in Australia or Africa or Brazil. There really isn't one for North Florida. And while our climate is like some of those other climates, our soils are obviously different.
And 4.
Okay.
Okay, George, other George, you
Yeah.
had your hand up for a while.
I'm just curious, you mentioned that research on this plant has been done back as far back as 1930. And very briefly, would you give a perspective first when carbon sequestration was first the topic on that plant? And then before that, all those years, what was the focus way back in 1930, the 30s? And if you knew about sort of a timeline of changing focus, I'd be curious about that. I don't want it to take up much time because there may be more important things to discuss.
Yeah, I can make this short. Carbon sequestration only became an issue really very recently. Prior to that, what's been for a few decades, starting in the 70s, really, and maybe earlier, and maybe in the 60s a little bit, was the various biofuel possibilities and the various routes to biofuel, everything from direct combustion to methane production, to methanol production, to the cellulosic ethanol efforts that George W. Bush was pushing, and were never quite entirely successful on a commercial level, but have never entirely gone away either. They've just sort of lingered without ever really happening in a big way. So all that stuff has been going on. It first got going in a major way in the 70s. It's never developed into a massive commercial thing either. There's been a bunch of reasons for that. One of the reasons was the scare with basically lobby from sugarcane growers in South Florida. And that's one of the reasons for the desire to move this whole effort to North Florida, South Georgia area, because why have that fight if there's just no reason for it? especially since some of the later research realized it's a lot more economically sensible to let the frost kill it, to let the rain then wash any deleterious basically compounds out of it, like, you know, the mineral compounds out of it that would just make combustion processes of biofuels normally more difficult and compound the process. Just go ahead and wash the mineral salts out of it, and then go ahead and harvest it. Yes, you're going to get a somewhat lower yield, but you saw the picture of the standing stalks come spring. Basically, all the lignin, I mangled my word. All the lignin is still there. All the woody material is still there. Most of the dry weight is still there come spring. And so the vast majority will still be there after a few rainfalls. With a significantly reduced mineral salt component, you'll get a much cleaner burning fuel, cleaner, frankly, than anthracite or coal or fresh cut wood or anything else, best as we can tell. But we need some really formal studies because with little research has been done on that. So we want a formal, complete, instead of individual studies, what is a more complete comprehensive study that puts together a growing production harvesting guide. Here's make it work economic so that this is a boon to everybody wins, rather than having things that we don't even know that we don't know crop up and bite us all where we don't want to be bitten. And then to your earlier question, prior to the 70s, people were really looking at this as an animal feed. Giant varieties were first introduced in the 30s, but you really have to manage the giant varieties more than beef farmers wanted to, because they grow so fast that if you're not rotationally grazing them with very careful management, they get away from you, and you basically have palm trees with all the lower leaves stripped off that the cattle then have to trample down in order to get to the leaves to eat them. And farmers here weren't really familiar with the idea of taking grass and making it into silage, so they didn't really have a plan for how to deal with it, and it just became too much of a management headache, and it never caught on. And then Professor Mott from the University of Florida found the dwarf variety Mott, and it basically became this thing that was just really expensive to plant because it was vegetatively propagated. And so it developed almost like a cult following of a few small scale producers who are absolutely in love with it because it has higher weight gains for cattle than literally any other crop out there. Quality of the beef produced is one of the highest. It basically, the people who love the Mott claim that it has the highest beef quality. The people who love peanut grass claim that it has the highest beef quality. Both of them basically boutique beef product that they sell for astronomical prices to select clients. But both crops are such a pain to get established that it's basically people selling boutique beef at prices that make me blanch. Because the crops are a pain in the neck to establish. And so it's never caught on for mass production. There is work being established, and this is sort of off the record stuff that I'm not going to go into detail on ways to commercial scale production rather than hand labor scale vast planting, but there's discussions, and I don't know that I'm at liberty to talk about all of that. I really can't say more. So that has been almost like a cult following for the dwarf forage varieties in this country. In countries where labor is far, far cheaper, you see a lot more of it. You see a lot of literature out of Brazil for multiple dwarf varieties being used as a cattle feed. You see all sorts of varieties being used as a cattle feed, both dwarf and giant in Africa, where they're willing to do the work to manage it. Because basically you have lots of smallholders who can't afford a lot of land but want to raise cattle. And so that brings us up to the 70s, where it started being investigated as a fuel. Answer your questions?
Yeah, oh yeah, thank you.
Yes, no?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Any other questions for John? So John, you're looking for us to kind of endorse this idea or recommend this idea to the county commission. Is that for them to fund a research study?
I would be very encouraged by that support. I would, I'm not asking you to do anything that you're not ethically comfortable with. And this is why I have repeatedly said, read the slides, but don't just take my word for it. To whatever extent you want, you don't just have to go to, Marston Science Library at UF to look this stuff up, although you can, and they let anybody look stuff up there for free. You can just go online and do Google searches and read things that are online for free in Google Scholar. And with as much time as we've already spent talking, you can verify what I've said. But yes, endorsement to the county commission or to your local congressman, one paragraph letter or email or phone call would be really nice, because I genuinely think that this is a way, this has the potential, there are no guarantees in life, but this has the potential to be an asset across the board. It has a way to mitigate environmental impacts, to mitigate economic impacts, and to be profitable for the local farmers and the local economy. I think, I'm going to just be blunt. I was a lot less worried until I saw the hell that this whole Ukraine invasion is bringing down on everybody worldwide right now. My heart goes out to all those poor people, don't get me wrong, but my best friend is an investment banker. And after talking with him and seeing the shifts that are happening at major high levels, that we don't have time for me to go into. It has frightened me badly. And anything we can do to insulate our local economy against the shifts that could happen, I think we desperately need to, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. And so what you're asking us to endorse or recommend is not necessarily this whole project at a large scale, but to recommend a study, a smaller scale study as a proof of concept.
I would ask you to endorse, I would ask you to take the time to look at the slides, think about the slides, think about what you feel comfortable with, and endorse what you feel comfortable with. Okay. Do what you think is right. That's what I would ask. I'm not going to ask you to do anything you're not comfortable with.
For sure. Yeah. And I don't think we would do that either. Okay. Yeah. I mean, for me personally, right now it feels out of my depth to make any kind of recommendation one way or the other. I know there's others that are more familiar with this topic and, have more background on the science and stuff, and they might have a stronger opinion right now. But for me, I'm a little bit you know,
I
yeah,
get
it's
that.
something I'm still taking in. But
I get that, and I expected that. And it's not a criticism. I've spent my entire life in either as a hobby or professionally in ag sciences. So
yeah,
it's not a criticism of you for that fact that you're still taking in this. I'd be surprised if you weren't, unless you like had a graduate degree in the field.
right. Yeah, but we really appreciate the time and the presentation. You know, obviously it's something that you've been researching and thinking about extensively, you can, you know, tell. So I think, you know, I don't know how everybody else feels about, you know, making any kind of recommendation, but we are meeting in person potentially next session. So at our May meeting, and we can discuss the option of doing that, I think at that time.
Okay. Can I give you all my email now, and can somebody send me, you know, invite, whatever, location, time, date?
Yeah, I mean, the meetings are open to the public, and you know, I don't know what else is going to be on the schedule in terms of, you know, having you, you know, kind
I
of
don't
talk
need
to us
talk.
again.
No. I just schedule is packed, and just wanted to make sure that I don't lose track of it. My brother's
Oh,
in the
sure.
hospital.
Oh, well, I wish him all the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, of course. We can, I think Mark can send that information to you when we have the details of the meeting.
Marvelous. Thank you so very much.
For sure.
Okay. Anybody have any other questions? I'm sorry that I do apologize again for the technical glitches. I still don't know what's going on there, and I am grateful for everyone's indulgence.
Thank you so much, John.
Okay, take care. Have a good one.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, so nothing else is really on the agenda other than the usual housekeeping. Anybody want to follow that up with any feedback?
I'd like to hear George's thoughts. Well, both George's really, and David.
Yeah.
On
Yeah.
this. I mean, obviously they're trying to promote a product. And so I respect that. I don't know. And as somebody who, for us, and if it wasn't for the GRU plant, then I'd say, well, what's the point? But because the biomass plant's been burning trees, and trees have been cut, that some of them have been regulated trees, has caused us some heartburn here at the county. And the problem with that plant site is once it's stoked up, you got to keep it running. You can't just shut it down when you don't have fuel, because then it costs so much money to start it back up again that they want a constant fuel source. And so the fact that there's another potential product of mass material that could be used to burn is noteworthy. But the fact is, the cost benefit of growing that and shipping it and the amount of energy to benefit is too many unknowns for what I could tell. I mean, I appreciate their effort, but I don't know until there's more data. I mean, if it was that good of a deal, why aren't more people, particularly on the western part of the county, growing this in big pasture areas where they could generate more revenue than off of planting pine trees or cattle. So I think there's just a lot of questions, I think, from that standpoint. And it comes across a little bit like they're like grasping here, trying to find money to even showcase their tractor, you know, and I'm like, well, if you're that scrambling for money, then I don't know that, you know, where's the benefit? And I think what both for the Columbia and Alachua County commissioners, they've kind of like, well, go to EPAC and then work your way up. And I'm like, well, you know, I don't know if that's like the answer that I don't know what that accomplishes, but
I don't think they've done their research yet, you know, Mark, enough research. The other thing that bothers me is if they're doing this up here, you know, out there in the northern part of the state, you know, they're doing this on the west side of the ridge, you know,
right.
and has to use that much, you know, nitrogen that it's going to get into groundwater, you know. I mean, that's going to make it right into the aquifer. So I really hate seeing. I don't know. There's just too many questions I had about too many places in the process, you know, to work for me. I mean, there are better ways to get energy, you know, which is you're genuinely not going to damage the environment, whereas they're not looking just for energy, they're looking for a way of, you know, making money from this and too. So I you know, if I just had to say how I feel about it right now, I never feel bad voting, you know, with my heart or my, you know, the feeling I get once I've listened to as many facts as my brain is possible holding, which usually isn't too many. But you know, based upon things that George said, and you know, basically the overall you know, lack of certainty, you know, that you know, the presenter at John seemed to, you know, have, I'm not sure this is a good idea.
Well, particularly as you noted, what's the trade-off? You're going to have to irrigate, you're going to have to put down, you know, fertilizer. And those, you know, in terms of, let's say, planting pine and using that as your biofuel, you don't have those constituents and issues to contend with. And being on the ridge, you know, water and fertilizer are big issues, as you all know. And I don't know that trying to solve one problem, you end up potentially creating a bigger problem that's more environmentally damaging than overall than trying to solve the problem that you truly intended to do. So I don't know. It's just sometimes if it looks too good to be true, then why isn't everybody doing it already? So I don't know.
Mark, I have a real quick question. You mentioned that the biomass plant has been, much to everyone's concern, burning whole trees, healthy whole trees. Since when? I thought that they predicated this biomass plant and got the permit to not do that.
When the plant was up and operating and then the 2008 crunch hit, there was no demand for pine, for lumber. And so it actually was a lifesaver for people in the timber business during that period. But under the guise of Right to Farm Act, and if they're burning planted pine, that's one thing, we support that. But what we have found is people actually cutting down regulated hardwoods and actually at no economic gain to themselves and using that to fuel the plant site. GRU does not require material brought in to have a ticket saying that where they got that wood, that they don't have to prove that they got it legitimately, that it was not regulated resources. All they're buying is wood chip.
Why don't we have enforcement to go after this, to change that behavior?
We've talked to GRU and the problem is because it costs so much to, now that they own and operate that plant site at millions of dollars of expense, they do not like to shut it down. And with the goal of having zero emissions over 50 years, they view right now, it's kind of like, what do? We operate. I mean, there's like a half a dozen of these biofuel plant sites that are built around the country that were done, as John had indicated, were done right before natural gas and fracking really kind of hit. So it was kind of like, let's build these plants. And that plant, from what I've been told, was not really intended to be that large. But they went ahead and said, well, big is good, bigger is better. I don't know. And so they went ahead and built it as a, but there are actually a few of these plant sites where they've basically said, let's just push them down. Just stop this, because they've gotten so inefficient in terms of that they figure the technology between batteries and other sources, wind, solar, that eventually there'll be other forms of regenerative that are more efficient than biomass. And so, but right now, GRUs, because they have this big ticket, millions of dollars every month they have to pay after, to keep that thing operating and to pay off the loans, the bonds, that they look at this as part of their suite of operations, even though it is really a low percentage of their generation. It does look good on paper that they're using as regenerative source. And I'm not saying that what tree material being hauled in there is all bad. I mean, I would hope a large percentage of it are material pine that would go to mulch plant, instead, but now with lumber prices as high as they are, legitimate pine are going to the mills to make lumber. So to keep the biomass plant site operating, you go to hardwoods. Some of these hardwoods are regulated trees that people are, under the guise of agriculture, cutting them down to avoid paying tree mitigation fees. We do our best to control it, and particularly, and we can to a certain degree in those areas that are zoned for residential use because they are regulated. But in areas that are zoned agriculture, if they have a legitimate timber license, given through the property appraisers, we're kind of limited in being able to stop that. So it's kind of the bugaboo. It's kind of the elephant in the room. People kind of don't like to talk about it because it's being abused, and it comes up periodically when we have a site. We just had one actually near Pine Hill subdivision area that's going to be developed, no doubt. But if you actually can cut the trees in the way our regulations are, you have to either plant it back in pine or let it come back up in pine, and you cannot come forward with a development plan for only 5 years. So people avoid having to pay the tree mitigation by just sitting back, waiting 5 years, and then come in. So this caused some real problems. The property appraisers, for the most part, have tried to help with that because they recognize that when they have a piece of property that's like in Jonesville, that they know is going to be developed, they don't say, okay, here's your timber, go to town. They'll say, no, you're not, a legitimate, timber operation, and therefore, but, again, we're not trying to shut down the biomass plant site. Well, nobody's ever said that. No, we just would like it to be legitimate, like pine trees that are planted and grown for lumber or for the biomass plant site, not a 200-year-old tree. That's not what, where it's not a benefit. And in fact, from the amount of fuel and the amount of processing in those situations, neither the landowner or GRU make any money on those deals. It's just, it breaks even, let's put it that way. But, it avoids having to pay a tree mitigation fee. So, yeah, it's a problem. I don't think this is the solution personally. I think the only way that you could grow enough material, again, it would have to be substantial. At the same time, the cost and the benefit of the resource, or what it could do with the resources in terms of environmental, both water, fertilizer, nutrient loading. You kind of almost have is an appropriate trade-off. I don't know. I just don't. Again, I think people will look and look. They can plant pine trees. They don't have to worry about irrigate them. They don't have to fertilizer. They come back in 10 years. Harvest them. To say, or if they let it go for the lumber, they need to go 15 to 20 years. But if they're doing it for just mulch or for the biomass, then they'll chip it, burn it. They can make some money off of it. But I don't know. It just seems to me like there's too many unknowns.
And Mark, by doing that with trees, especially older trees, it's like the older tree is something that's not being used right now. It's kind of a fossil fuel all of its own in a way. Whereas the new, just smaller plants that come and go, every season, that's a whole different story. Burning that is from the standpoint of just the amount of carbon dioxide that's being recycled. It's always going to be, it's always in one of those two places anyways. It's always in the atmosphere or in a plant.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, everybody looks at it as like but there's been enough studies to show that, in terms of carbon emissions, what's biomass plants, they emit more than they actually uptake, in terms of, carbon. And from that standpoint, it's kind of like, that's another reason why I think probably nationwide, once natural gas became it's like anybody that was ever thinking about biomass, they jumped it. They just said, we're not building multi-million-dollar plants that are not efficient. And in the case of,
but we know we can't compare this or put it even on a scale with somewhere with methane, because of there's these huge clouds of methane that are being released by factories all the time, and some of them are just so large that they're just unfathomable. I mean, there's that much gas being released all over the world, and so we really can't compare that. I mean, it may have been a cheaper product, but it's just not a practical product from the standpoint of the amount of of global warming that is causing. So we really have to stay away from the methane too. We really need to go to products that are genuinely as non-polluting as possible. And still that brings us back to wind, wave action, and sun, solar. Those are our best options right there, I think. So
until
I'd say no on this. I really would. I mean, it's not even a kind of a doubtable. Just listening and going through this whole process of the after discussion is kind of, I've been to the point where I say no. I'm just solid.
I have I guess a clarification that I need, or a question. So one thing is, are we gonna, if we keep the biomass plant running, would this be some kind of, would the cost benefit of this new material or this material be, advantageous from an environmental standpoint? And my question, I guess, with what with what John was proposing, was like, they don't want to necessarily, they're not asking to like full out develop this right now. They're asking to do a kind of research study on it. And what are they going to be measuring? What are they going to be basically collecting data on? Because like Mark, you said, there's a lot of questions around it. Why aren't more people using it? And like, what are the inputs and outputs and all of that stuff? And is that the kind of research that they intend to do with this money? Because that would get maybe a different recommendation from me than like, do I just recommend this as an idea? Do you know what I mean?
Right, and that's a valid, you're right, Nisha. I mean, I think they're looking for support wherever they can. And I think, NRCS has agreed to, just for y'all's sake, they've asked for $3,000 from Columbia County, 3,000, or the way it looks, 3,000 from Alachua County, and to match a $6,000 grant that they're getting from NRCS. That's just for a one-day demonstration project to rent the tractor. And it's like, and the way it was voiced to me through Tom was that Columbia County is looking to Alachua County. If Alachua County says yes, then they'll maybe support it. The facility is in Columbia County. So from that standpoint, why are they looking to Alachua to, unless they have some reservations about even giving them $3,000? And I don't know how much NRCS is tied to, committing their 6,000 if they don't get the matching funds. But again, I'm like, if they are that stretched to come up with $12,000 just for a demonstration project, how in the world are they going to have a long-term study that requires substantial funds to come up with a more definitive decision as to how this is going to go? Plus, as you kind of noted, if they have to, let's say they can't get anybody from Alachua County landowners, to come up to propose to do this, the cost of transporting this material down from Columbia County, to the biomass plant site, I'm like, I don't know. I just don't, I question, are they getting the cart before the horse a little bit here? But again, I can appreciate there's a degree of research for the sake of research. So,
Well, John mentioned that one of their goals.
Sorry, George,
I'm
Bruce
sorry.
had his hand up. I just want to make sure he.
Sorry. Yeah,
Oh.
sure. Sorry.
Okay, what I wanted to say was I think EPAC should take the time-honored political tradition and take the whole matter under advisement.
Well, I'm just here. I would suggest that might be the best, because you don't necessarily want to be the one out there out front carrying the flag for something that nobody else is running out there with the flag, promoting it. They're just saying, well, get EPAC's, blessing. That would get the county commission's blessing, Alachua, then that would get Columbia's blessing. And I'm like, to me, it's like, if they can't come up with $12,000 for their, one day, I'm like, they got bigger problems than getting support. I'm like, I don't know. It's like, I don't know that the problem, I fear for the sake of EPAC that it may come across as that y'all are supporting something that has been unproven.
There's another option, and the option is that, for what it's worth, I think the risk on this is too high for us to get take any part of that risk under, for us. There's no benefit for us doing that. I think that the best thing we could do is to say, well, we really can't recommend this, but we aren't really now, we really can't say, not to do it, but at the same time, we can't recommend it. And, if they want to talk more about the reasons why, we can put something together for them. But I think basically, that's kind of just a standing back approach. And then they have to kind of make up their mind based upon what other people may have to tell them about it, rather than taking something from us and using it to move forward on this project and have it be a disaster.
Well, I agree.
Yeah.
I looked at George on this. If this is why isn't UF pouring tons of money into it? I mean, if it's that good of a deal, you would figure IFAS would be, providing them tons of money. I just don't, but again, I think for the sake of EPAC, it's like, yeah, I mean, if they want to go to the, and I think this is where they realize the problem is that they can't just go to the county commission, because I think the county commission already said, go to EPAC. And if they feel like it's a great deal, then get their support and come back with it and we'll consider it. But for $3,000, I'm like, I don't know that.
And, you know, there's a lot of other places they can get funding from if they have a, you know, a genuine researchable, you know, idea, especially in climate control, you know, I mean, you know, they should be able to get money for that in a lot of places. So I think they're going to the wrong place for the money. I really, if it's research.
Let me just give you a little bit of background on this thing, just short.
Okay, and then the other George, who was also wanting to say something.
Go ahead, George.
This project has been, I've been familiar with the project for probably 4 decades. Gordon Prine was a big proponent of these energy canes and elephant grasses and so forth. He was in the agronomy department, and he had a real cool project down on the mine lands in Polk County, growing these products, as looking at them as an alternative crop for those clay settling ponds after the phosphate had been mined out. And also a side benefit of using these crops, these big grassy crops, for a dewatering crop to get the water out of the clay, so that then you could go on and maybe come up with some farming crop production ideas. So he spent a lot of time in his career working with these types of crops, and he also worked on them up here in Gainesville on the agronomy research farm, which used to be out on 241. It's now the sports park. And so Gordon was your go-to person on all of this. Now, Tito French was also a faculty member in the agronomy department and worked a little bit in these crops, but he was mostly into perennial peanut. Now, Tom Cornelio was also worked in the department. He wasn't a faculty member. So he is kind of out, you know, on the outside of the UF umbrella now, has been for quite a while. I have had several times when Tom, I know Tom not real well, but I know him enough to, when he calls, to, you know, listen to his questions and so forth, and try to help him. So I think these guys are looking for some alternative enterprises for this agroforestry program that Tom has. This is the first time I heard or met or knew of John. So I think their presentation was more of a 30,000 foot, gee, you know, if we could just get $1 million, we could do all kinds of stuff with it. But when you press them on important questions, I think, about, hey, you know, you guys are talking about growing this stuff up here in the northern part of the state where it frosts, so you can't grow it year round like you could down in South Florida and get those kinds of huge yields. So where did you get 10 to 15 tons of dry matter? That's a hell of a lot of stuff. And moreover, what does it take to produce that in terms of irrigation and fertilizer and whatever?
And they're relying upon the freeze to kill the seeds. So
they can't answer that. All they can do, you know, John was just, you know, going on and on and on with all this smoke and, you know, and mirrors. And I got kind of frustrated with all of that because I wanted to hear. And so if they'd come in to me and said, you know, we have done some medium-sized on-farm scale tests of 100 acres of this stuff, and here's what we found out. Here's what it takes to grow. Here's what you can get out of it, and made that kind of a presentation that would tell somebody that, hey, you know, these guys got it pretty close, and now you would feel more comfortable about jumping off the cliff with them. Right now, as far as that presentation, to me, I mean, he seemed like he was, you know, knowledgeable and everything, but I'm not convinced that they're anywhere near where they need to be making a presentation like that for that kind of money. And there ain't nobody going to come up with that kind of money to throw at them for that kind of a presentation. And I'll just close with this. If this was, like Marcus pointing out, if this was this close, maybe there's not any growers out there chomping at the bit to do it, but those guys would have found growers to grow 20 acres, 50 acres, whatever, to do a proof of concept of this before they come into this group and essentially ask for some blessings to go forward with it. I mean, it might be the greatest thing if they could get there, but I don't see it happening on sandy soils west of I-75. I don't see it in North Florida because of the frost and the short growing season that we have up here, that they're going to get the kind of yields that they're talking about.
Weren't they also talking about needing to prevent it from spreading around? I mean, that was one of the reasons why he was saying that the freezes helped him, especially since it took, it was so late before it flowered. So I would think that's they can't do it downstate for that reason. They can't do it up here for, the reason you're not get the yields. I mean, there's just, maybe that plant doesn't belong in Florida. I mean,
It struck me a bit as a fishing expedition, and the long narratives were trying to keep the ball floating off the ground, like a game or something. He also put the burden on us to do the research,
Yes.
to read the literature. And I would have felt a lot better if he had distilled it down and been able to succinctly report on a series of research studies that would back up what he proposed, rather than having us do the work.
Exactly, George.
mhm.
It felt a little uncomfortable there, as though they hadn't had enough time to work it through, or knew that they didn't have the data anywhere to support it.
So it sounds like we're a no on endorsing.
Consensus was, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm glad we settled it before the next meeting. Saves us a whole discussion, I guess.
I mean,
Well, I
they're
appreciate
gonna
that.
probably come back and say why. And I think the response to them is that, hey, I mean, I would be totally blunt with them. Hey, your presentation didn't move your ball down the court down the field very far. And this is what we thought was lacking. And, if you got the magic out there somewhere hiding, you better go get it.
Well, I greatly appreciate y'all's input, because I wanted y'all to hear all that and get your input for it. Tom has called me almost every day for the last 2 weeks trying to get all this together and I'm like, almost like a panic mode. And I'm like, Tom, you're giving a presentation. We're not voting on anything. And then he wanted the committee to draft a letter. And I'm like, you're the one asking for money. I'm not gonna, I can't in good faith look at the committee and saying they don't have the information, and whatever information they can decipher from your presentation, that's not going to be sufficient to write a letter of support to the commission and just ask for $3,000. I'm like, I don't know that anybody would look at that as kind of like, just kind of almost like
It's
a car
amateurish.
salesman situation. It would be questionable. So I know he'll be calling me tomorrow. And
Mind you, I've seen Alachua County commissions throw away $100,000 on something that,
You're
was
right.
never gonna
You're
happen.
right.
So it's not the money.
And they may say, yeah, give them 3,000, but I'm like, my concern is like, if it was that good of a deal for the commission, why did they just say, go to EPAC, don't come to us? Unless, that's not to say that they might not try to go to the commission again. I'd be a little surprised, but I'm like, again, I would look at it more like, if they're looking at EPAC to carry their flag for them, I don't want to be a situation where EPAC is like out there with a flag and all of a sudden they turn around, there's nobody behind them to support. It's like, well, and to sit there and I appreciate it's like $1 million. I mean, they're asking for pocket change now, not even pocket coins, just to get a demonstration project. But you're saying you need $1 million to do the
Maybe
big
we should
picture.
write-
I'm like, Good
maybe
luck
we
with
should write
that.
at least, maybe we should at least write a, a short, report to the Board of County Commissioners on this, and really the person to do that, I mean, it shouldn't be more than like a page even to do, or even less than that. And maybe George, you could do that because you're our treasurer in this area, that's for sure. I mean, I really, it's times like tonight, especially, that I'm just so feeling that we are so blessed to have you with us. But
No, I honestly think that being silent on this whole issue speaks volumes.
yeah, you might be right.
Yeah.
You might be
I
right.
agree. I don't think we need to write the county commissioners. I also wonder if we can move on to the next item.
What's
Yes.
that?
I don't know.
Is that you mean adjournment?
No, that's it.
Adjournment.
That's closing the meeting, I think, adjourning the meeting, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, unless anybody has any other things they would like to mention, we can wrap up, and then next meeting, if they visit again, hopefully some people who are a little bit more eloquent about this subject can kind of briefly tell them why we're not going to make any kind of recommendation.
We could all just
one way or
fall
the
asleep
other.
through the meeting. I mean, that might work.
I have comical, but real, some physicists, if you have, did some research on graphene membranes, carbon atoms, one next to the other. And they were able to generate electricity without any electrical input, purely on the basis of Brownian motion. And so the speculation now is that if they can create a giant battery filled with gazillions of these graphene membranes, each one generating a tiny amount of electricity by random movement, and it's the excursion. They actually are able to detect the ups and downs and the degree, the excursion of that Brownian motion is what somehow they're able to harvest the charge. So they could create batteries that had required no input and were continuous as long as we don't have entropy. And that'll be a long time. But anyway,
These
that's
membranes are the
something
one,
to work
one
on.
atom thick.
Just tune
right?
in to next week's.
Hey, George,
What's that?
are these membranes the one atom thick membranes?
Yeah, they just
Yeah.
just carbon atoms, a blanket, undulating, and they harvest it. So tune in a few weeks from now. We'll have enough energy to take care of everything.
I wish I had known that when I was a kid. I could have told my teacher that my, that entropy ate my pencil or something.
Right.
So Mark, would we be meeting back at the Siegel building in their old spot?
I think so. I think there's enough room in there to where if people spread out, it won't be an issue. And we have a better camera there now. So I suspect it just makes it easier. Trying to get in and out of the administration building has gotten to be such a hassle. So I'll check with Steve tomorrow, but I think if y'all are up for, and again, people will have if people want to just do Zoom, they can do that, or they can be at the building. I'll be at the building. So it's up to the individual how they want to.
I was going to ask you that because I can't always, sometimes I get very low blood pressure these days and I can't do anything. And that, I want to come, but if I'm feeling that way on that day, it's best that I don't, hop in the car and drive anywhere. So.
No, that's fine. That's understandable. So, yeah, I mean, I'll talk to them, but I think, that's kind of, they're getting to that point right now. The climate change advisory group they don't want to meet, in person. So, I'm not saying that y'all either, but y'all would not be the only one that it's not meeting in person. So it just depends on y'all how you want to do it. We have a few vacancies that are coming. David Gold had to resign because of health issues. Not that it's not life-threatening, but he just had some issues, and so he might be able to come back. And then Trista Brophy took a position in St. Augustine, so she left. And then I forget her name, the one woman that came on board, and she attended like one meeting and that was it. It's like, so I know Bruce is, I think both Bruce
I think you said June.
in June, I think you and I think there's one other person that they're 10 years up in, but so what I'm saying is there'll be a few openings. So, yeah, I think, we'll address that come May and June. But yeah, till then, I mean, I'll talk to Steve about, meeting at Siegel if y'all want to, and those that do, great. Those who don't,
Yeah.
I don't see it as a problem,
I'll try to be there.
I probably won't be at the next meeting. David, I'm finally, after about a year of dilly-dallying, I'm finally moving to a smaller apartment. I signed the papers
Oh, wow.
the end of last week, but I only have a month to do it, and I have so much crap to sort out and get rid of to make this move to the smaller apartment, 788 square feet.
Oh.
Yeah.
Eh,
So the next meeting, there'll be boxes behind you.
I don't know where I'll be the next. I don't know when. I'm insisting on some changes before I move into the apartment. One of the things is they have to paint the ceiling the way that it is here, which is a blue sky with white puffy clouds.
Hey, you've got a beautiful place there. Yeah. How many square feet do you have in your current place?
Right now I have 1,100.
Okay.
I have a bedroom and a full bath, and then a smaller bedroom and a half bath, but I'm going down to just one bedroom, one bath.
Now, you don't have room to trip it or even change your mind in your apartment. So I'm wondering, where are you going to put all the extra stuff? You have storage space for that? Oops.
I have my work cut out for me.
Yeah,
Well, some of the bigger pieces, relatives of Brandy's coming in a 16-foot U-Haul to take away some of the big pieces. But still, I have so much small stuff. Like I have a china cabinet that I put out on Facebook for sale, but nobody seems to want, which is fine, except it's just filled with china and glassware.
Oh, wow. Yeah, where would you put all that stuff anyway, right? So
Yeah, I think I'll end up boxing a lot of things and worry about disposing of it later.
or sell it. You have yourself a gigantic garage sale. Sell it.
I'm selling some stuff on Facebook and Craigslist, but it takes time to take good enough pictures and then describe everything.
Yeah.
It's with all the other. I'm overcommitted. My doctor has told me to cut down. I have an autoimmune disease now that he says is caused by stress, and so I'm going to be dropping out of some things.
Jump out of the stress first. I mean, this. Okay, I move that we close this meeting before it's tomorrow.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right, everybody. Have a good night.
Appreciate
Me
it.
too.
It's fun.
Thank you.
Bye.